to make a start, I said I'd start with a snapshot of the current picture on pay, and that's what this slide shows here. So you can see that we've got the whole economy on the left, and then the different components of the whole economy, the private sector, manufacturing, and so on. And the top line, of course, is the most important because that shows the median for the latest period, which is the 3 months to October. So you can see that it's 4% overall, 3.8 in the private sector, and there's a bit of a gap there between manufacturing on the one hand and services on the other. 3% for manufacturing, 4% for private services. Now, there's a couple of other points to take away from this slide. One is that in general, the average is higher than the median. That's important. So that shows that some employers, many employers, in fact, as we'll find out, are making higher awards. And in most cases, the interquartile range is relatively wide as well. And the upper quartile in most cases goes relatively high. So again, an indication that some employers are responding to the environment that we've got by raising pay at above average levels. Now, the one exception to this, the one sector that's an exception, is private services, where the average is actually lower than the median. And the interquartile range is both fairly narrow and it doesn't go up that much. And I think that's possibly because private services is the one area of the economy where trade unions are weaker in many parts, and perhaps employees don't quite have the bargaining power that they have in other sectors of the economy. Now, I say that, but of course, bus and rail are also in private services, and those are two areas where, as we know, because of what we're doing today, they're actually on strike over pay. So there is some bargaining clout, but that's not true of private services as a whole. So I think that accounts for the difference rather between that sector and the others. So that's the headline stats on pay at the moment. How are awards distributed? Well, if you look at this next slide, as I said, the median is 4% overall, but what this bar chart shows is it shows what proportion of awards are in different brackets of increases. So you can see that there's no pay freezes at the moment. And then the distribution goes up until we see the greatest numbers in the 3 to 4% range, or just below 4%. And then the important point really is that at the higher end, over on the right of the slide, we've got quite a large proportion of awards. So awards worth between 5 and 5.9%, or 6% plus, together they make up over a third of awards in the current period. So that's very significant. You know, in fact, this chart really is skewed to the right. If I'd shown you a chart like this at any point between 2010 and a year ago, it would have been much more normally distributed, like a Head and Shoulders, with probably equal numbers of pay freezes and higher end awards. But at the moment, it's all about the higher end awards. So that's the current snapshot. Again, that's for the latest period for 3 months to the end of October. We haven't quite published our information on the 3 months to the end of November. That's coming in the next week or two. So that's the current snapshot. Just to look at the trend for a minute, this is probably the most complicated slide, so don't worry too much. There won't be many more or even any more like this. So what this shows is the picture on pay, our headline median, which is the grey line, compared with the different measures of inflation. Those are the coloured lines. And it goes from 2007 over on the left, all the way up to the present day, or almost to the present day. Again, it's the 3 months to the end of October. And what you can see is that at the very beginning of the period, there was a kind of a relationship between the median pay award and inflation. So as inflation rose just before the crash back in 2008, the median followed it up a little bit, albeit it lagged behind it as well in terms of both time and in terms of magnitude. Then the crash happened. You can see that as indicated by the fall in inflation around 2009, and pay settlements followed it down. They recovered a bit, but then as inflation moved around over the next decade or so, pay settlements didn't. They remained pretty much stuck at 2 to 2.5%. My team, in fact, I don't think ever believed me when I told them that pay settlements had been higher and could be higher again. But since then, and over the last year or so, we've seen a change in behaviour, haven't we? We've seen pay settlements rise. The levels shown over on the right-hand side of the chart. But the important takeaway, of course, is you can see that gap with inflation. And we have got new inflation figures this morning, but I'll turn to those in just a minute. So that's the kind of trend. That's how we've got to where we are today. So the distribution of 2023 awards so far, that's those. Oh, sorry, that was backwards. Oh no, where am I? Yeah, there we are. Good. Fine. I'm going to skip over this slide, and I want to talk about the. No, actually, I will talk about this slide a little bit because. Bear with me. Sorry. Now I'm on the right slide at last. Very sorry about that. But this is a look ahead to 2023. So what we've been doing is we've been talking to you and to other employers and asking you if you've made decisions already on pay awards for 2023. And the information that we've collected so far produces the following picture in terms of the distribution. So there's two takeaways from this slide. One is that just like the picture for the current period that I showed earlier, it's very much skewed to the right. In other words, the emphasis is all on the higher end. And in fact, the proportion of awards that are worth at least 5% has actually grown. So it's at 41% of awards, which is just over 2/5. So that's very interesting. On the other hand, there's a bit of a switch. So the slide I showed you earlier, if we just return to that, you can see there's more awards in the 6% plus bracket than in this one. Okay, so that's quite interesting. But we're at a very early stage. We're not even in 2023 yet, but we're looking at awards that are set to be paid in early 2023. Many in January and a couple a little bit later. And so that's the picture so far. We'll revise it as more information comes in, but that's very much the picture so far. So I said I wanted to look at the labour market, and that's what I'll do now. So we had new figures come out from the Office for National Statistics just yesterday. So what do they show? What do they show about the labour market at the moment and where we think it might be going? So the first couple of things to say is employment is up again. And crucially, the number of employees on payrolls it has shown another record rise. So just under 30 million employees on payrolls, higher than it's ever been in terms of people on payrolls in permanent work. So that's the good news. The less good news is that unemployment actually went up very, very slightly in the latest figures. It rose from 3.6 to 3.7%. But of course, as anyone who's been around as long as I have knows, that's historically very, very low. It's at early 1970s levels, before things got bad. The other interesting aspect of yesterday's figures was that economic inactivity, where people are neither in work nor looking for work, it had been rising right throughout and since the pandemic for a number of reasons, which I'll come to in a minute. But yesterday's figure shows that inactivity actually fell for the first time in a long while, and it went down by 0.2 percentage points to 21.5% of the working population, of the population that's counted for these things. Doesn't include over 64s, by the way, that figure. And the reason it fell, the ONS think, is that people who had retired early have returned to work in the main because inflation is so high and they're worried about their own personal finances. Now that's very important because to the extent that inactivity had been rising and people had been taking themselves out of the workforce, it was presenting as a form of tightness. Not tightness in the normal sense of things in terms of vacancies not being filled and so on, But nevertheless, they weren't adding to that kind of reserve army of unemployed people that allows employers feel a bit easier about what they might offer in the labour market. So that could be significant, but let's see what happens. Job vacancies fell again. They have been falling over the last little while, but they're still historically very, very high. And redundancies are up slightly, but again, they remain, very, very low overall. So I think what I would say in overall terms, how I would characterize the labour market at the moment is that there may be signs of softening, but overall, it's still very, very, very tight. And that point about inactivity, I think that will be one to watch, because in the autumn statement, the government said that they wanted to conduct a review of economic inactivity to try and work out what's going on with that. Because it is one of the issues in the labour market. So it'll be interesting to see, A, if the government press ahead with that, and B, if they do, what they'll find. Okay, that's the labour market. So what do I want to turn to next? I want to look at, some specific problems in the labour market, because we've looked at it generally. I want to look at it a little bit, sector by sector, job by job, if you like. I think the first thing we can say is that the worst affected areas are probably childcare, hospitality, and social care. If you're in those areas, you know all about it. Retail and distribution has benefited to an extent from people leaving those areas, sadly. But that doesn't mean that retail and distribution aren't affected by the tight labour market at the moment. And of course, other areas as well. And you'll all have your own stories, I'm sure. One of the things that us and the ONS have been seeing is the scale of job-to-job moves at the moment. And that's even though the economy seems to be heading for a downturn. And one of the reasons people are moving from job to job is that in certain sectors, retail is one, but other sectors as well, employers are leapfrogging each other on pay. In fact, in some sectors, we've seen more than one pay review in the year in order that firms can kind of keep ahead of each other on pay. And that's making employees moving for better pay, in essence. I mentioned inactivity. That's a factor in the labour market too. It's a tightening factor, I would argue. We shouldn't ignore the fact that the labour market is characterised at the moment by shortages in various specific areas. And again, all of you will have your own stories, your own experiences of what occupations you're finding it hard to recruit and retain to. There is a shortage occupations list that the government produced. I think I would say that that's also affected by politics. It probably doesn't really reflect the reality for firms. And the other thing I would say is that when we're thinking about where the labour market might go, it's also true that many EU countries face similar problems to Britain. Now, if that's the case, that doesn't bode well for us getting out of these, getting away from these problems. I think they might be here, even in the event of an economic downturn, which you might expect would soften up the labour market significantly. But let's see what happens there. Okay, so that's the labour market. I wanted to turn to what employers are doing to try and respond to some of these problems. So I've talked about inflation, I've talked about the labour market. What is it that employers are doing? Now, I've put up this slide because it kind of encapsulates some of the issues that you might be facing. So I've talked mainly about recruitment and retention, but of course a big factor for employers is what is employees' morale looking like? How motivated are they to work? This is an interesting slide because it's from the CIPD, their latest labour market outlook survey. And it asked employers what they thought about their employees' financial situation and whether they expected it to improve, stay the same, or worsen in comparison with now. And you can see that over 70% think it will worsen. It'll worsen somewhat for just over half, and then a fifth think it will worsen significantly. So that's employers' thinking on this issue, and it kind of encapsulates the situation that many many of you are facing as people who have to make decisions on pay. So what does our research show about what organisations have been doing? Well, I've got a number of things to talk to you about. Now, the next slide will show the main initiatives in respect of reward. So I'll come to that in a minute. And by reward, I mean pay, you know. But you know, employers are looking at other things often, you know, often because, you know, they can't always increase pay, or at least they can't keep on increasing it. So they're looking at other elements of the benefits package in order to try and do something about these issues. So what we're seeing are things like extra holidays are being offered. In a small number of cases, but significant number of cases, we're seeing employers trial shorter working weeks. That's quite interesting. I think the jury's very much out on that. Whether it can improve productivity, I think, will be the tester for whether other employers actually do that. We're also seeing, in a small way, but again, we think it's important, employers where previously most staff were on spot rates of pay, they're actually providing them with limited but nevertheless real in-grade progression for the first time. So the chance to increase their pay as long as they grow in the role. And I think that's key. In other words, you know, as long as there's an impact on productivity and there's something in return for the organization, then we've seen a number of employers begin to introduce this. In the latest issue of our bulletin, Pay Climate, we've actually got a case study of a care organisation, Salute them, who have done just this. So if you are a subscriber to Pay Climate, you can read about that there. If you're not a subscriber to Pay Climate, obviously give us a shout and we can sort it out for you. The other things we've seen are things like subsidised meals, even free meals in some cases, very important given the price of food. Help with childcare. Financial well-being is a massive theme. I'm sure you've already begun to think about that. We've even seen some employers help their staff with housing costs, which I think is interesting, but you do need to check the tax implications of that. And lastly, just to kind of give you some resources to help with all of this, the CIPD, you know, hopefully you're all members, have a very useful hub on how to help employees in respect of the cost of living crisis. And I've put the link to it up there in the slides. And some of their blogs cover this topic as well. So that's the kind of thing we've been seeing broadly. Now, I said I'd talk specifically about pay. The initiatives are under kind of three main headings. On the one hand, we've got what might be called interim or short-term awards, which is a fancy way of saying more than one pay award in a year. And the other area, and this is a big one, is one-off payments. And I should say that these are generally one-off payments made in addition to a basic pay rise. And then the other one I want to talk about is a thing called flat rate rises, where an amount, you know, 1,000 or more, is consolidated into people's basic pay so that it's worth more for the lower paid than those paid higher up the scale. Now, that's a minority pursuit, but it's spread from the public sector into the private sector recently. So it's become more important, and we're seeing a bit more of it at the moment. So going back, interim or short-term awards, organisations that have made more than one award this year, I've listed just some of them, big names as you can see. Curry's at the bottom, they made 3 awards in 13 months. So that shows you the speed at which the labour market is moving in their area. And some of this relates to what I talked about in terms of employers leapfrogging each other on pay. So this is one of the ways they're doing it. They're making more than one award in a year, and they're keeping ahead of the competition in order to recruit and retain staff. Now, one-off payments, big theme this year. What we found is that this kind of approach is going to continue almost certainly. We know from our research, from our poll of employers, that they've said they're going to continue this into 2023. And by the way, the flat rate rises approach that I mentioned as well, we think that might continue in 1 or 2 sectors too. We've heard that Lloyds Bank, for example, have just done a deal with staff which will pay £2,000 on a flat rate basis, consolidated into basic pay, to staff. So that's worth about 8% for somebody on £25,000 a year. So it's not insignificant. And Lloyds are going to pay an extra one-off lump sum as well on top of that of £500. So those two trends that we've seen there, one-off payments and flat rate rises, continuing in to 2023. And like I said as well, employers that we've polled on their pay intentions for 2023 have told us that they're going to continue with the practice of one-off payments into 2023. Whether we'll see more than one pay award into next year is an interesting point. I think that will largely depend on what the economic picture brings. But let's see what happens. So that's just some of what our research is showing. Now I want to move on to what the outlook for next year might be, because I can imagine that's why a lot of you are on the call. So let's do that. Yeah, so as I've said, the labour market I think remains very tight. A big question is how recession might affect that. You know, the recession, depending on who you listen to, is either looming, it's either coming, or it's already here. Now inflation, that's very interesting, because as I said, we've had figures out this morning for the year to November. They're actually slightly lower than they were. So 14% on the RPI, I think it had been 14.2, 9.3 on the CPIH, which I think had been 9.6, and then the CPI is a little lower again. That had been 11.1, but it's now 10.7%. So what does that mean? The reason it's fallen, by the way, is because motor fuels are falling in price. So that's important to remember. So what does it mean? Now, it might mean that inflation has already peaked, and that what we're going to see is inflation begin to come down. I'll turn to that in a minute. I'll turn to the prospects for inflation precisely in a minute. But of course, you know, the predictions might not be right. It could stay higher for longer. And as to what happens in the longer term, there's all sorts of questions. You know, both the labour market and inflation, I think, are very, very important. In terms of inflation, I think one of the issues at the moment is the way in which food prices form a major part of it. And the ONS, in its latest release on these figures, has commented on that. I think climate change is playing a role in making food prices higher. That's not going to change, sadly, anytime soon. So I think those kinds of upward pressures on prices will remain. But that doesn't mean that the forecasters might not be right. On the labour market, my own view is that even if recession takes place, it might not lead to the kind of softening of the labour market that we've seen in previous recessions. You know, in part because, you know, many firms are too big to fail. We might not see the kind of impact on unemployment that we've seen previously. I mean, certainly the crash of 2008, unemployment rose, but it didn't rise to anything like it had been in the 1970s or 1980s. So my view is that even if the labour market softens a bit, you could still see labour market pressures and shortages of roles in specific areas. So that will continue to present upward pressure on pay. So let's see what the forecasters say about inflation. Now, this is interesting. So what this chart shows, I told you there wouldn't be too many charts. This is the second. Hopefully it's easy. I'll talk you through it. It brings together, it's our average of forecasts from a group of city institutions, including Capital Economics, Deutsche Bank, NatWest Markets, Societe Generale, and other bodies as well. And what we do is we collect the forecasts from these economists, independent economists, and we average them. And what they show is we collected them a few weeks ago, so they show their prediction for this morning's figure and for the next 18 months ahead. So hopefully that's clear. And the orange line is their forecast for the RPI, and the blue line is their forecast for the CPI. Most of them don't forecast the CPIH. Now, as you can see, the red line, they got it bang on. The RPI is 14% this morning, so the predictions, the average of the predictions is exactly right. But the CPI was a little bit lower than predicted, so that's very interesting. But I think that the takeaways from this is that inflation looks like it's going to drift down, but it's going to drift down very, very slowly over the next year. So in other words, it's going to remain elevated in comparison to what we've been used to over the past while. And like I say, you know, there are pressures that are keeping employment inflation elevated, you know, such as climate change. You might assume that recession will clobber inflation. I mean, in the past that has sometimes been true, but we've also been through, you know, periods like in the 1970s where the economy hasn't grown, where, you know, the economy was characterized by stagnation, but at the same time inflation still rose, a phenomenon called stagflation, and we could be headed for that kind of phenomenon, but we will have to see. That's the important thing. You know, certainly over this past recent period, the forecasters, the economists we speak to, have been constantly revising their forecasts for inflation, and I think they'll continue to do that over the next while. So what I would say about this graph, again, just to recap, is that inflation might come down, but only very, very slowly. And these are just predictions, remember. So the far right-hand side of the graph, I would take that with a pinch of salt for the moment. Let's wait and see what happens. Okay, hopefully that's clear. So I wanted to look at employers' intentions again. Now, we've asked them, employers, what they might pay in terms of pay awards next year, and we polled some 181 mostly large organisations, so quite a decent sample of organisations. And you can see from the figures, the two bars on the far right hand side, if you add them together they add up to more than half. So more than half of employers think that their pay award next year will be at least 5% or could be more. So that really reflects the backdrop that we've been talking about, doesn't it? I think that's quite important. So that's the outlook for pay awards. I thought I'd mention this. I mean, if you don't know about the national living wage and the voluntary living wage, well, you shouldn't really be on the call. So I presume you do. You know, obviously the rise in the national living wage, the legal minimum, is a major upward pressure on pay at the moment. It's set to rise by 9.7%. The other takeaway from this slide is that the voluntary living wage, it's now £10.90. But when the national living wage rises in April, that will go to £10.42. So there's a much smaller gap than there has been between the two of them up until now. And I think that's a testimony really to the influence of the voluntary living wage. It's much more influential now than it used to be. I think the pandemic has given it a boost that it didn't really have before the pandemic, with thousands more employers accredited to pay the voluntary living wage. So both of those, I think, are important things to look out for. So finally, or not quite finally, I just wanted to try and encapsulate, you know, some of the upward and downward pressures on pay, you know, to try and get you thinking about, you know, what might happen over the next while. So I've listed the upward ones on the left and the downward ones on the right. I've started with the upward ones because I think, you know, personally, I think most of the pressures at the moment are upward. So, you know, just to go through them, some of them are obvious. Inflation, the general labour market situation, it's still a seller's market. Specific issues. I think the post-pandemic situation whereby the term key worker has come to be assigned to a much larger group of workers than it had been previously, I think is quite important. You know, previously, if you thought about key workers, most people thought about public sector workers. But in fact, you know, during the pandemic, it spread to the people who deliver food, the people who work in supermarkets, the people who work in pharmacies, you know, many more, you know, lorry drivers, many more groups than before. And I think that does tend to kind of add to upward pressures on pay. We've seen it feed into a collective response. I don't need to tell you about that. You know, we're here, I'm here rather, and you're there because of that increased collective response. And I've already mentioned the statutory wage floor and the voluntary living wage. So what might be the offsetting factors? Well, the possibility or the probability of a recession, whether that will impact the labour market, it probably will, I would say, but you know, how, I think, is the big question. The government have given us some help with our energy bills. You know, whether that's enough is a point of debate. Inflation could moderate. The government could prevent people going on strike, though let's see. And then maybe, if there is a recession, the brakes might be put on in respect of the national living wage. But of course, as we know, that's not going to happen now till 2024 at the earliest, because this year it's going to rise by 9.7%. So kind of swings and roundabouts, but I think on balance, most of the pressure remains upward for the moment. So finally, just to finish, what I think some of the key issues might be. For anyone who makes decisions on pay and has responsibility for staff, I think you're in a very difficult situation at the moment. So my heart goes out to you. You've got to square a circle, really, haven't you? You know, recruitment, retention, and motivation on the one hand, but then affordability on the other. And I think inflation just makes that. Luckily, we can help. I think in order to do that, you need information, you need data. I think that's more important than ever at the moment, you know, with inflation and the labour market like they are. And we can give you information, not just in terms of pay reviews, but we also provide information on base pay levels. We can help you benchmark pay. We can help you benchmark elements of pay like shift premiums and things like that. And the wider benefits package as well. We also do research on that. That's quite important. But I wanted to finish with a final point. I've talked a lot about recruitment and retention of staff, but of course, morale and motivation, really important. With inflation so high, there's the risk, isn't there, that employees aren't really thinking about work, but they're thinking about their finances. And of course, there are things you can do to, you know, help them focus on work. You know, and reward is a carrot for doing that. But there's another aspect of it, isn't there? And that's that employment and reward is a relationship. You know, you can't simply give people something and then expect nothing in return. I think you know, the picture around productivity and the kind of trade-offs and the quid pro quos, if you like, between employees and employers, I think are really important at the moment. And I've said there in the slide that making sure that managers are trained, and I mean at all levels of your organization, to try and optimize those quid pro quos, I think is almost as important as making sure you're getting pay right. But hopefully the information I've given you this morning will help you do at least that, and you can get on with some of the other things as well. So that's enough from me. I'll stop talking, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has. Thanks a lot.